The Silent Protector's Secret. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as guard Thomas Mitchell adjusted his iconic red tunic one final time. At 24 years old, he had spent 3 years perfecting the guillot, art of absolute stillness, learning to become a living statue that tourists photographed but never truly saw as human. His black bearskin hat sat precisely at regulation height, and his polished boots reflected the early light like mirrors. Thomas had always taken pride in his role as one of the Queen's Guard. The position demanded physical endurance, mental discipline, and an unwavering commitment to duty that few could maintain. Day after day, he stood motionless for hours, his rifle positioned exactly as protocol demanded, his expression neutral and distant. Tourists would pose beside him, sometimes making faces or telling jokes hoping to break his composure. Children would wave energetically, their parents explaining that the toy soldier couldn't wave back. But behind the stoic facade, Thomas was acutely aware of everything happening around him. He noticed the elderly woman who visited every Tuesday, always carrying fresh flowers to place near the palace gates in memory of her late husband, who had served in the military. He observed the young father who brought his disabled son in a wheelchair every month, the child's face lighting up with wonder at the sight of the guards. He saw the school groups with their excited chatter, and the lonely tourists taking selfies, with forced smiles. On this particular morning, something felt different. The usual crowd of tourists was thinner than normal, and there was an unusual energy in the air. Thomas had learned to read the subtle changes in atmosphere during his time on duty. His fellow guards communicated through almost imperceptible signals. A slight shift in posture, a barely noticeable adjustment of equipment, or a momentary eye contact that conveyed volumes. As the morning progressed, Thomas noticed a commotion near the palace gates. A small crowd was gathering around something he couldn't quite see from his position. His training kicked in automatically. Maintain position, stay alert, but don't break character unless absolutely necessary. The safety protocols were clear, but they also allowed for human judgment in extraordinary circumstances. The crowd grew larger, and Thomas could hear voices becoming more urgent. Someone was calling for help, though the words were muffled by distance and the general noise of the city. His partner, Guard Williams, was positioned about 30 feet away, and Thomas could see the subtle tension in his colleague's stance that indicated he too was monitoring the situation. Then Thomas saw her, a little girl, no more than 5 years old, had somehow separated from her parents in the growing crowd. She was crying, spinning in circles, clearly terrified and lost. Her small voice carried across the courtyard as she called for her mother in what sounded like a foreign language. The tourists around her seemed unsure how to help, some taking photos of the quaint scene, while others looked genuinely concerned but hesitant to intervene. The child's distress was escalating rapidly. She began to run in random directions, her panic making her movements erratic and dangerous as she came closer to the busy street beyond the palace grounds. Thomas felt his heart racing beneath his perfectly pressed uniform. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to help, to break the rigid protocol that had been drilled into him through months of intensive training. His commanding officers had been clear about the rules. The Queen's Guard must remain at their post regardless of external circumstances. They were not police officers, not social workers, not tour guides. They were ceremonial protectors whose primary duty was to maintain their positions and uphold the dignity of their ancient role. Breaking character could result in serious disciplinary action, potentially ending his military career. But as Thomas watched the little girl stumble and fall, scraping her knee on the rough stones, something fundamental shifted inside him. The rigid military training that had shaped him into the perfect ceremonial guard suddenly felt less important than the basic human compassion that his parents had instilled in him long before he ever wore a uniform. The child looked directly at him then, her tear-streaked face filled with hope and desperation. In her eyes, he wasn't a tourist attraction or a symbol of royal pageantry. He was simply an adult who might be able to help her find safety. The weight of her gaze felt heavier than all his military equipment combined. Thomas made a decision that would change not only his own understanding of duty, but also touched the hearts of millions of people around the world. He took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to do went against everything he had been taught about protocol and proper conduct for a Queen's Guard. The tourists with their cameras had no idea they were about to witness something extraordinary. The other guards on duty couldn't predict that their colleague was about to demonstrate that sometimes the highest form of duty isn't following rules, but following one's heart. Even Thomas himself didn't fully understand the impact his next actions would have, not just on one frightened child, but on everyone who witnessed what happened next. As he prepared to take his first step away from his post, Thomas realized he was about to learn the most important lesson of his military career. That true honor sometimes requires the courage to break the rules for something more important than regulations. The ceremony and tradition that surrounded his role were valuable, but they were ultimately in service of something greater, the protection and care of those who needed it most. The little girl continued to cry, and Thomas knew there was no more time for hesitation. The moment had arrived when duty to protocol would either triumph over duty to humanity, or when a ceremonial guard would step out of character to become something even more meaningful, a protector in the truest sense of the word. The first step, Thomas Mitchell's first step away from his ceremonial post, felt like crossing an invisible threshold between two different worlds. The familiar weight of his rifle, the precise positioning he had maintained for hours, the absolute stillness that defined his role, all of it dissolved in an instant as he moved toward the crying child. The tourists around him gasped audibly. Cameras clicked and phone videos started rolling as people realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. A Queen's Guard was breaking character, abandoning his post in the middle of his duty. Some visitors looked shocked. Others seemed delighted by this unexpected deviation from the usual rigid ceremony. Thomas reached the little girl in 6 measured strides, his heavy boots echoing on the stone courtyard. As he approached, she looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes, temporarily startled into silence by the sight of the tall figure in the iconic red uniform and towering bearskin hat. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the trained soldier and the lost child, both finding themselves in unfamiliar territory. Slowly, carefully, Thomas removed his bearskin hat and set it on the ground beside him. This simple action sent another wave of amazement through the watching crowd. The hat was not just part of his uniform. It was a symbol of centuries of military tradition, worth thousands of pounds, and absolutely never to be casually placed on the ground. Without the imposing headpiece, Thomas looked younger, more approachable, more human. His hair was matted with sweat from the weight of the hat, and his face showed the strain of maintaining perfect posture for hours. But his eyes were kind and concerned as he knelt down to the child's level, bringing his face closer to hers. "Hello, there," he said gently, his voice carrying a soft London accent that seemed strange coming from someone the crowd had assumed was more monument than man. "Are you lost?" The little girl nodded vigorously, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. She spoke rapidly in what Thomas recognized as Italian, her words tumbling over each other in her distress. While he didn't understand the language, the universal tone of a frightened child was unmistakable. "It's okay," Thomas said, instinctively reaching out to pat her shoulder in comfort. "We'll find your mummy and daddy. Don't worry." He looked around at the crowd of tourists, many of whom were still filming the unprecedented scene. Among them, he spotted several people who seemed more concerned than entertained. Thomas raised his voice slightly, maintaining the gentle tone he had used with the child. "Does anyone here speak Italian? This little girl is lost and needs help finding her parents." An elderly Italian couple immediately stepped forward, their faces filled with relief and gratitude. The woman knelt beside Thomas and began speaking rapidly to the child in Italian, her voice soothing and maternal. The little girl's sobs began to subside as she listened to familiar words and saw a kind face. Through the Italian woman's translation, Thomas learned that the child's name was Sophia, and she had become separated from her parents when the crowd around the palace gates had suddenly grown larger. Her parents were somewhere nearby, probably searching frantically for their missing daughter. Thomas stood up and surveyed the area systematically, using the observational skills that his military training had sharpened. His elevated position and familiarity with the palace grounds gave him an advantage in spotting potential search patterns. Near the main gate, he could see two people who seemed to be looking urgently through the crowd, their body language radiating the desperate energy of parents searching for a lost child. "I think I see them," Thomas said, pointing toward the gate. The Italian woman confirmed that the description matched Sophia's parents, and together they began making their way through the crowd, Thomas carrying the little girl who had wrapped her arms trustingly around his neck. The reunion was immediate and emotional. Sophia's parents rushed toward them, tears of relief streaming down their faces as they saw their daughter safe in the arms of the uniformed guard. The mother reached out to take Sophia, while the father gripped Thomas's hand in both of his, speaking rapidly in Italian while tears flowed freely. The Italian translator woman explained that Sophia's father was expressing his deepest gratitude, saying that Thomas was a hero, an angel, that they would never forget this kindness. The father kept trying to press money into Thomas's hands, which the guard politely but firmly refused. As the family embraced and their crisis subsided, Thomas suddenly became aware of the crowd that had gathered around them. Dozens of tourists had followed the scene, many still recording on their phones. The realization hit him that his actions had been captured by multiple cameras and would likely appear on social media within hours. More immediately concerning was the sight of his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, pushing through the crowd with a stern expression. Thomas felt his stomach drop as he remembered that he had abandoned his post without permission, violated numerous protocols, and created a public spectacle, all actions that could result in serious disciplinary measures. The little girl, now safe in her mother's arms, turned back to Thomas and spoke a few words in Italian, while reaching out her small hand toward him. The translator smiled and explained, "She says thank you to the nice soldier man, and she wants to give you something." Sophia pressed a small crumpled drawing into Thomas's hand, a crayon sketch of what appeared to be a castle with stick figures standing guard. She had apparently been working on it during their visit to the palace and wanted to give it to the guard who had helped her. As Thomas looked at the innocent artwork, he realized that the child had understood something that all his military training had somehow missed. The guards weren't just ceremonial figures or tourist attractions. In Sophia's drawing, they were protectors, guardians watching over everyone who came to visit. Her simple picture captured the true essence of what his role should be, beyond the rigid protocols and ancient ceremonies. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison finally reached them, and Thomas straightened to attention, still holding Sophia's drawing. He prepared himself for the consequences of his actions, knowing that his military career might be forever changed by the decision to step away from his post. But as he looked at the reunited family, at the crowd of tourists whose faces showed admiration rather than mockery, and at the small drawing in his hands, Thomas realized that some rules were worth breaking. Sometimes duty to humanity had to supersede duty to protocol, and sometimes stepping out of character revealed more about true character than staying rigidly in formation ever could. The ripple effect. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison stood before Thomas Mitchell with an expression that was difficult to read. The crowd of tourists had dispersed somewhat, but many lingered nearby, still processing what they had witnessed. Some were already posting videos and photos on social media, their captions filled with praise for the guard who had broken protocol to help a lost child. "Guard Mitchell," the lieutenant colonel said in a measured tone, "return to your post immediately. We'll discuss this matter after your shift ends." Thomas snapped to attention, but as he began to walk back toward his position, something unexpected happened. The crowd began to applaud. It started with Sophia's parents, who clapped enthusiastically while calling out words of gratitude in Italian. The sound spread through the gathered tourists like a wave, growing louder and more sustained with each passing moment. Children who had been watching wide-eyed began cheering, and adults joined in with genuine appreciation. Some tourists called out, "Well done, and you're a hero." The applause continued as Thomas retrieved his bearskin hat from the ground and walked back to his ceremonial post, his face flushed with embarrassment and confusion. As he resumed his position, Thomas tried to process what had just happened. In his 3 years as a Queen's Guard, He had never experienced anything like this reaction from the public. Usually, tourists treated him as part of the scenery, interesting to photograph, but not to truly engage with as a person. Now people were looking at him differently, not as a curiosity or a living statue, but as someone who had done something genuinely meaningful. The shift change couldn't come soon enough for Thomas. When his replacement arrived, he made his way to Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's office with heavy steps, expecting to face serious consequences for his breach of protocol. The walk through the palace corridors felt longer than usual, each step echoing his growing anxiety about his military future. Harrison's office was exactly as Thomas remembered from his previous visits. Walls lined with military honors, photographs of distinguished service members, and the subtle aroma of pipe tobacco that seemed permanently embedded in the furniture. The lieutenant colonel gestured for Thomas to sit but remained standing himself, hands clasped behind his back. "Guard Mitchell," Harrison began, "what you did today was completely contrary to established protocol. You abandoned your post, removed essential uniform components in public, and created a spectacle that was recorded by numerous civilians." Thomas felt his heart sinking. Everything the lieutenant colonel said was factually correct. He had violated multiple regulations, and military discipline demanded consequences for such actions. "However," Harrison continued, and Thomas looked up in surprise, "what you did today was also fundamentally right." The lieutenant colonel moved to his desk and opened his laptop, turning the screen so Thomas could see it. The video of his interaction with Sophia was already playing on a news website, with the headline, "Queen's Guard breaks protocol to help lost child, humanity wins." "This video has been viewed over 50,000 times in the past 2 hours, Harrison explained. "The comments are overwhelmingly positive. People are calling you a hero, praising the Guard for having members with such compassion and humanity." Thomas watched the video in amazement. Seeing himself from an outside perspective was surreal. The tall, imposing Guard kneeling down to comfort a frightened child, removing his ceremonial hat without hesitation, carrying her through the crowd to safety. In the video, he looked exactly like what he had hoped to be when he first joined the Guard, a protector and servant of the people. "The palace has received dozens of phone calls today," Harrison continued, "all of them positive. Sophia's father managed to find our contact information and called personally to express his gratitude. He said you saved not just his daughter, but his family's entire vacation, and possibly prevented a much more serious situation if she had wandered into traffic." Harrison closed the laptop and sat down across from Thomas, his expression becoming more personal and less official. "Thomas, I've been in the military for 28 years. I've seen soldiers follow orders perfectly and accomplish nothing of real value, and I've seen others break rules for the right reasons and change lives. What you did today falls into the second category." The relief flooding through Thomas was almost overwhelming, but Harrison wasn't finished speaking. "That said, we can't have guards regularly abandoning their posts, no matter how noble their intentions. So here's what we're going to do. We're implementing new emergency protocols that allow guards to temporarily step away from ceremonial duties when civilian safety is at immediate risk, provided they signal their intention to their partner first." Thomas realized that his actions hadn't just affected himself and Sophia's family, they had actually changed military policy. The idea that his instinctive decision to help could result in improved procedures for future situations was both humbling and encouraging. "Furthermore," Harrison added with what might have been the beginning of a smile, "you're going to receive commendation for your actions today. The Guard's reputation has been enhanced by your demonstration of the values we're supposed to represent. Not just ceremony and tradition, but service to others." As Thomas left the lieutenant colonel's office, his mind was reeling from the unexpected turn of events. What he had expected to be a career-ending mistake had instead become a defining moment that would be remembered positively for years to come. Walking back through the palace corridors, Thomas encountered several of his fellow guards who had heard about the incident. Their reactions varied. Some seemed envious of the positive attention he was receiving. Others appeared genuinely proud of his actions. But what struck him most was that they were all looking at him as a colleague who had done something significant, rather than as someone who had simply failed to follow orders. That evening, as Thomas reviewed the day's events, he realized that stepping out of character had actually revealed his true character more clearly than years of rigid adherence to protocol ever could. The ceremony and tradition of the Queen's Guard remained important to him, but now he understood that these things were valuable only insofar as they served a higher purpose, the protection and service of the people who looked to them for safety and inspiration. Sophia's crayon drawing sat on his bedside table, a simple reminder that sometimes the most important duty is simply being human when humanity is what someone needs most. The little girl had seen him not as a ceremonial figure but as someone who could help, and in responding to that trust, Thomas had discovered something essential about what it truly meant to serve. The veteran's last visit. 3 months after the incident with Sophia, Thomas Mitchell had settled into his new role as something of a celebrity within the Queen's Guard. Tourists often asked specifically to see the guard who helped the little girl, and children would wave more enthusiastically at him, somehow sensing that he might actually notice them behind his ceremonial mask. On a crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled around the palace grounds, Thomas was maintaining his usual post when he noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was the elderly woman he had observed many times before, the one who came every Tuesday with fresh flowers. But today was Thursday, and something about her appearance seemed different. Margaret Thornton was 82 years old and had been visiting the palace weekly for nearly 15 years. Her husband, Sergeant Major William Thornton, had served in the Queen's Guard during the 1960s before moving on to active military service. He had died in 2008, but Margaret continued their tradition of visiting his old post, bringing flowers that she would quietly leave near the gates while saying a private prayer. Today, however, Margaret was struggling more than usual. Thomas could see her laboring with each step, pausing frequently to catch her breath. The small bouquet of white roses in her hand seemed to weigh more than it should, and her usually steady gait was noticeably unsteady. As she drew closer to the palace gates, Margaret stumbled slightly, catching herself against the iron railings. Several tourists noticed her difficulty, but seemed unsure whether to offer assistance. Thomas watched with growing concern as she attempted to compose herself, straightening her coat and adjusting her grip on the flowers. Margaret had always maintained her dignity during these weekly visits. She dressed carefully in her best clothes, applied her makeup with the precision of someone who had learned proper presentation in a different era, and carried herself with the bearing of a military spouse who understood the importance of showing respect for tradition. But today, the effort was clearly taking its toll. As she approached the spot where she always left her flowers, Margaret's breathing became more labored. She pressed one hand against her chest and used the other to steady herself against the gate. The white roses fell from her grasp, scattering across the pavement. Thomas felt the familiar conflict between duty and compassion that had characterized his experience 3 months earlier. The new emergency protocols that had been implemented after the Sophia incident technically applied to immediate civilian safety threats, but Margaret's situation seemed to fall into a gray area. As he watched the elderly woman struggling to gather her scattered flowers, Thomas made his decision. The lessons from his previous experience had taught him that sometimes the most important service a guard could provide had nothing to do with ceremony or protocol. He stepped away from his post and approached Margaret carefully, not wanting to startle her. As he drew near, she looked up at him with surprise and embarrassment, clearly mortified at having created a scene. "Ma'am," Thomas said gently, removing his bearskin hat as he had done with Sophia. "Are you all right? Can I help you?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears, though she tried to maintain her composure. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said in a voice that carried the refined accent of her generation. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I just come here every week to visit my husband's old post, and today I seem to be having a bit of difficulty." Thomas knelt down and began gathering the scattered roses, handling them with the same care he would show for military honors. "These are beautiful flowers," he said. "Your husband served here?" "Sergeant Major William Thornton," Margaret replied with evident pride. "He stood right where you were standing back in 1965. Same uniform, same duty. He always said it was the most meaningful service of his entire military career. Thomas felt a profound connection to this woman's story. He was literally standing in the footsteps of her husband, carrying on the same tradition, wearing the same uniform. The continuity of service across generations suddenly felt very personal and immediate. "Would you like me to help you place these flowers?" Thomas asked. "I'd be honored to assist you in honoring Sergeant Major Thornton's service." Margaret's composure finally broke, and tears streamed freely down her cheeks. "That would mean everything to me," she whispered. William would have been so proud to see one of his successors showing such kindness. Together, they arranged the white roses near the gate where Margaret had placed flowers for 15 years. Thomas learned that this ritual wasn't just about remembrance. It was Margaret's way of maintaining a connection to the most important relationship of her life, and to the military community that had shaped both her and her husband's identities. As they worked, Margaret shared stories about William's time as a guard. She described his pride in the uniform, his dedication to the ceremony, and his deep respect for the tradition he was part of. But she also talked about his humanity, how he had always been quick to help others, how he had never forgotten that his ultimate duty was to serve people, not just to follow regulations. "He would have done exactly what you did," Margaret said, referring to the incident with Sophia that had made Thomas briefly famous. "William always said that the uniform should make you more human, not less." When the flowers were properly arranged, Thomas helped Margaret to a nearby bench where she could rest. He signaled to his partner that he would be away from his post for a few more minutes, using the new communication protocols that had been developed in response to his earlier actions. Sitting beside Margaret, still in his full ceremonial uniform, Thomas felt the weight of history and tradition in a new way. He wasn't just performing a role that had been created for tourists and ceremony. He was carrying forward a legacy of service that connected him to decades of men who had stood in the same place, facing the same challenges of balancing duty with humanity. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a small, faded photograph. It showed a young man in a Queen's Guard uniform, standing at attention with the same rifle Thomas carried, wearing the same bearskin hat. But in the photograph, the guard was smiling slightly, as if the photographer had just said something amusing. "That's William in 1965, Margaret said. "He was about your age when this was taken. He always said that the best guards were the ones who remembered that they were people first, soldiers second." Thomas studied the photograph, seeing in William's face the same sense of pride and purpose that he felt when he put on his own uniform. But he also saw something else, a warmth and humanity that transcended the formal requirements of the position. As Margaret prepared to leave, she pressed the photograph into Thomas's hand. "I'd like you to keep this," she said. "William would want it to stay here, with someone who understands what this place really means." Thomas watched as Margaret walked slowly back toward the street, her weekly ritual complete. He realized that his role as a Queen's Guard had expanded far beyond what he had originally understood. He wasn't just a ceremonial figure or a tourist attraction. He was a keeper of memories, a bridge between past and present, and a living reminder that service to others was the highest form of duty. The Christmas miracle December air bit sharply through even the heaviest winter uniforms. But Thomas Mitchell had learned to endure the cold as part of his duty. 6 months had passed since his encounter with Margaret Thornton, and the photograph of Sergeant Major William Thornton now sat framed beside Sophia's drawing in his quarters, daily reminders of the human connections that gave meaning to his ceremonial role. Christmas week brought different crowds to Buckingham Palace. Families traveled from across the world to see the famous guards during the holiday season, bundled in heavy coats and scarves, their breath visible in small clouds as they snapped photos and marveled at the pageantry. The atmosphere was more festive than usual, with Christmas carols drifting from nearby street performers and the warm glow of holiday lights reflecting off the palace windows. Thomas had drawn the Christmas Eve shift, which meant standing guard while families elsewhere gathered around dinner tables and children prepared for Santa's visit. Military service often meant missing important moments with loved ones, and Christmas Eve was traditionally one of the hardest days for soldiers stationed away from home. As afternoon faded to evening, the crowd began to thin. Most tourists headed back to warm hotels or restaurants, leaving behind the few dedicated royal watchers who never seemed to tire of observing the guards. Thomas was mentally preparing for the final hours of his shift when he noticed a commotion near the main gates. A family of 4 had stopped near the entrance, engaged in what appeared to be an intense discussion. The parents looked frustrated and worried, while 2 young children, a boy about 8 and a girl around 6, seemed on the verge of tears. The father kept checking his phone and looking around anxiously, while the mother tried to comfort the children. Thomas recognized the signs of tourists in distress, likely lost, possibly separated from their tour group, or facing some other travel emergency that seemed overwhelming in a foreign country. The family appeared to be American based on their clothing and the fragments of conversation he could hear, but they seemed genuinely confused and upset about something. The situation escalated when the little girl began crying loudly, her sobs echoing across the courtyard. The boy, trying to be brave for his sister, was clearly fighting back tears of his own. Their parents looked increasingly desperate as they tried to manage their children's distress while dealing with whatever crisis they were facing. Thomas found himself once again confronting the balance between protocol and compassion. His previous experiences had taught him that rigid adherence to regulations sometimes prevented guards from fulfilling their most important duty, serving the people who looked to them for help and protection. He caught the attention of his partner, Guard Robertson, and used their established signals to indicate that he was going to investigate the situation. Robertson nodded slightly, understanding that Thomas might need to step away from his post if the circumstances warranted. Thomas approached the family carefully, removing his bearskin hat as had become his habit when dealing with civilians in distress. The parents looked up at him with surprise and relief. Clearly, they hadn't expected one of the famous Stoic guards to actually come over and offer assistance. "Excuse me," Thomas said politely. "I couldn't help but notice you seem to be having some difficulty. Is there anything I can help you with?" The father, a man in his 40s wearing a Chicago Bears jacket, looked almost stunned that a Queen's Guard was speaking to him. "Oh, wow," he said. "We didn't expect, thank you so much. We're having a really tough time here." Through the father's explanation, Thomas learned that the family, the Johnsons from Illinois, had been staying at a hotel near the palace as part of their dream vacation to London. But there had been a mix-up with their reservations, and they had been forced to check out that morning with nowhere else to go. Every hotel they contacted was fully booked for Christmas Eve, and they had been walking around London for hours with their luggage, trying to find accommodation for the night. "The kids are exhausted," the mother, Sarah Johnson, explained with tears in her eyes. "This was supposed to be magical Christmas vacation, and now we might have to spend Christmas Eve sleeping in the airport or train station. Everything's closed and we don't know anyone in London who could help us." 8-year-old Michael Johnson looked up at Thomas with the same kind of trust that Sophia had shown months earlier. "Are you really a Queen's Guard?" he asked with wide eyes. "Do you know the Queen?" Thomas knelt down to Michael's level, just as he had with Sophia. "I am really a Queen's Guard," he confirmed. "And while I don't personally know the Queen, I work to help protect her and everyone who visits here. That includes making sure families like yours have a good experience in London." The little girl, Emma, had stopped crying and was staring at Thomas with fascination. Like most children, she seemed to understand instinctively that beneath the impressive uniform was someone who genuinely cared about helping them. Thomas thought quickly about possible solutions. His military training had included basic knowledge of London's emergency services and support systems, but finding hotel accommodation on Christmas Eve seemed like an impossible challenge. However, his months of interacting with tourists had given him connections and resources that might prove useful in this situation. "Let me make some calls," Thomas told the family. "I know some people who work in the hospitality industry around here. Give me a few minutes to see what I can arrange." Thomas stepped aside and used his mobile phone to contact several people he had met through his work at the palace. Palace security maintained relationships with nearby hotels for various official purposes, and Thomas had developed friendly connections with concierges and managers who often dealt with tourist emergencies. His first call was to James Morrison, the manager of a boutique hotel about 10 minutes' walk from the palace. James had previously thanked Thomas for helping redirect lost tourists to his establishment, and he had mentioned that he appreciated the Queen's Guard's assistance with customer service. "James," Thomas said when the call connected, "this is Thomas Mitchell from the Queen's Guard. I have a family here with 2 young children who've been displaced from their hotel on Christmas Eve. Is there any possibility you might have a room available, or know of someone who does?" There was a pause before James responded. "Christmas Eve is always completely booked," he said. "But let me think. Actually, we had a cancellation about an hour ago. A business traveler had to change his plans at the last minute. It's our family suite. 2 bedrooms. Perfect for parents and children. I was just preparing to release it back to the booking system." Thomas felt a surge of relief and gratitude. "James, that would be incredible. The family is right here with me. The Johnsons, from Chicago. They're wonderful people who just need a safe, warm place to spend Christmas Eve with their children. Bring them over," James said immediately. "And Thomas? No charge for tonight. It's Christmas Eve, and if a Queen's Guard is personally vouching for them, that's good enough for me. Consider it our Christmas gift to a family in need." When Thomas returned to the Johnson family with the news, their reaction was immediate and emotional. Sarah Johnson burst into tears of relief, while her husband kept thanking Thomas repeatedly. The children began jumping up and down with excitement. Their Christmas Eve disaster suddenly transformed into an adventure story they would tell for years to come. As Thomas helped the family gather their luggage and prepare to walk to the hotel, Michael Johnson tugged at his uniform sleeve. "Are you like Santa's helper?" the boy asked seriously. "Because you just saved our Christmas." Thomas smiled, thinking about William Thornton's photograph and Sophia's drawing, about Margaret's weekly visits and all the other moments when his role as a ceremonial guard had become something much more meaningful. "No," he told Michael. "I'm just someone who thinks Christmas should be special for everyone, especially kids like you and your sister." The legacy of compassion. 2 years after Thomas Mitchell first stepped away from his post to help a lost little girl, the Queen's Guard had quietly but significantly transformed their approach to public interaction. The Mitchell Protocol, as it had become informally known among the guards, provided clear guidelines for when ceremonial duties could be temporarily set aside in favor of humanitarian assistance. Thomas stood at his familiar post on a bright spring morning, watching the steady stream of tourists who had come to witness the changing of the guard. At 26, he had been promoted to corporal, and was now responsible for training new recruits, teaching them not only the precise movements and regulations that defined their ceremonial role, but also the deeper understanding of service that had evolved from his own experiences. The transformation in public perception of the Queen's Guard had been remarkable. Where once tourists viewed them primarily as living statues or photo opportunities, there was now a widespread understanding that these were real people performing a meaningful service. Social media had played a huge role in spreading stories of guards helping visitors, and tourism to Buckingham Palace had actually increased as people hoped to witness moments of human connection alongside the traditional pageantry. Thomas had become something of an unofficial spokesperson for this new approach to guard duty. He regularly received letters from around the world, many from families whose visits to London had been enhanced by interactions with guards who followed his example. Sophia's family sent Christmas cards every year, always including a new drawing from Sophia showing guards helping people in various situations. Margaret Thornton had passed away the previous autumn, but not before seeing her weekly visits become a cherished tradition for several guards who had learned about her story. She had lived to see the installation of a small memorial plaque near her favorite spot by the gates, honoring all military spouses who keep the home fires burning. The guards now maintained her flower arrangement, ensuring that white roses were always present as a tribute to both her devotion and her husband's service. On this particular morning, Thomas noticed a familiar pattern developing near the main entrance. A young guard, Private Anderson, was maintaining his ceremonial position while clearly struggling with a situation unfolding nearby. An elderly gentleman using a walker had fallen while trying to navigate the uneven cobblestones, and his wife was frantically trying to help him up while managing their tourist bags and her own mobility issues. Thomas watched as Anderson wrestled, With the same internal conflict that had once defined his own experience, the new protocols gave guards permission to assist in emergencies, but they still required individual judgment and courage to act. Thomas could see the young private's uncertainty, the way he kept glancing between his duty position and the couple, who clearly needed help. Rather than intervene directly, Thomas decided to give Anderson the opportunity to make his own choice. This was how guards truly learned the balance between ceremony and service, not through lectures or regulations, but through facing real situations where their character would be tested. Anderson took a deep breath and stepped away from his post, removing his bearskin hat as he approached the fallen gentleman. Thomas felt a surge of pride as he watched the young guard carefully help the man to his feet, check him for injuries, and ensure that both he and his wife were steady before offering to help them find a place to rest. The couple was clearly overwhelmed by the kindness, just as Thomas had seen in dozens of similar situations over the past 2 years. The gentleman, who appeared to be in his 70s, kept shaking Anderson's hand and patting his shoulder in gratitude. Tourists who witnessed the scene began taking photos and videos, but unlike the initial surprise that had greeted Thomas's first breach of protocol, this reaction was one of warm appreciation for what had become an expected part of the Queen's Guard experience. As Anderson helped the couple to a nearby bench and signaled for medical assistance to check the man's scraped hands, Thomas reflected on how much had changed since that first moment with Sophia. The rigid interpretation of duty that had once defined the Queen's Guard had evolved into something more nuanced and ultimately more meaningful. The ceremony and tradition remained as important as ever. The precision of movements, the immaculate uniforms, the ancient rituals, all of these continued to serve their purpose of honoring history and inspiring respect for military service. But these elements were now understood as means to a greater end rather than ends in themselves. Thomas had kept in touch with Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had since been promoted and transferred to another unit. In their correspondence, Harrison had shared that the human face approach pioneered at Buckingham Palace was being studied and adapted by ceremonial units around the world. Military leaders had begun to understand that public service roles were most effective when they allowed for genuine human connection. The impact extended beyond individual incidents of assistance. Tourism boards reported that visitors to London increasingly spoke about their experiences with the Queen's Guard in personal terms, describing encounters that made them feel welcomed and cared for, rather than simply observed from a distance. The guards had become ambassadors for British hospitality, as well as symbols of military tradition. Thomas's own career had flourished in ways he had never anticipated. His actions had opened doors to specialized training in public relations and crisis management, skills that proved valuable both within the military and in civilian applications. But more importantly, he had discovered a sense of purpose that went far beyond personal advancement. As the morning progressed and the changing of the guard ceremony approached, Thomas prepared for one of his final performances in this role. He had been selected for officer training and would soon leave Buckingham Palace for advanced military education. His replacement had already been chosen, another young guard who had shown both the discipline to maintain ceremonial standards and the wisdom to know when human needs should take precedence. The ceremony itself unfolded with the same precision and grandeur that had characterized it for centuries. Tourists watched in fascination as guards moved in perfect synchronization, their movements sharp and purposeful, their uniforms gleaming in the spring sunlight. The music, the marching, the careful choreography of the changing of the guard continued to inspire awe and respect. But now there was an additional layer of meaning that enriched the entire experience. The tourists watching knew that these weren't just performers in costume, but real people who served others with both formal dignity and genuine compassion. Children waved more enthusiastically because they believed the guards might actually notice them. Adults asked questions because they understood that beneath the ceremonial exterior were individuals who cared about their experiences. As Thomas completed his final ceremony as a regular guard at Buckingham Palace, he thought about the unexpected journey that had begun with one frightened little girl and a moment of human instinct overruling military protocol. That single decision had revealed something fundamental about the nature of true service, that rules and traditions were most meaningful when they served the ultimate goal of caring for others. Sophia's crayon drawing still sat on his bedside table, now joined by dozens of thank you notes, photos from grateful families, and small mementos from people whose lives had been touched by guards who chose compassion over rigid conformity. William Thornton's photograph had been returned to its place of honor near the gates, where new guards learned about the legacy of service that connected them to generations of men and women who understood that duty to humanity was the highest calling of all. The Queen's Guard continued to stand watch at Buckingham Palace as they had for centuries, but now they stood not just as symbols of tradition and ceremony, but as living reminders that the greatest honor lay not in perfect adherence to protocol, but in the courage to step out of character when character demanded it most.